So one of the more popular videos on my channel when it comes to third gen content would probably have to be one of the earlier ones. I know I did one in this exact parking lot, kind of doing a walkthrough on the LS swap on my Camaro. The other one would probably have to be the walkthrough on the brake conversion that I did on the Camaro. I kind of just took everything apart and showed you guys the components that were used. I didn't actually do a walkthrough modifying the spindles, and all of that is going to be covered today. This thing is going to be getting some nicer parts than the Camaro actually has on it. So before we get started today, I just want to thank BigBrakeUpgrade.com for sending me a set of their all-new T6 aluminum billet conversion hubs. They also sent me a pair of LS1 brackets so we could put LS1 brakes on the front of this thing, and all the hardware needed to bolt everything up. Before I get into this guy, you guys need a little information on the stock braking system. Maybe just bought one of these cars. Maybe you've been wanting to do this conversion for a while. You took the wheel off and then you were like, oh shit, that's a problem. So here is the stock rotor off of one of these cars. As you can see, the rotor and the actual hub with the wheel bolts on, it's all one piece. It's not like a lot of other cars where you can essentially just take the old rotor off, take the old caliper off, and you could just bolt a bigger brake on from a different year. When it comes to these cars, it's a little more difficult because you can't do that. So once again, looking at the hub, you can see the rotor and the hub, it's all one assembly. We got a bearing in there, we got a bearing in the back, we have a seal. You can't just grab a new rotor here and slip it over. It's not going to work unless you could somehow figure out how to hook up two calipers and connect them, and it's not going to happen. You need a conversion hub. And that's exactly where BigBrakeUpgrade.com comes in. They've been at this for years. I have a set of their older steel hubs on the Camaro. I brake swapped that car over 5 years ago. When I was initially starting the swap, just looking through Google, looking through forums, Big Brake Upgrade was the go-to to do a conversion on these cars. And today they just have so many options available. You could put Z06 brakes on this thing, you could put CTSV brakes on it like I have on the Camaro, or you could just put like a standard LS1 brake. There are plenty of options. I'm going to put a link to their website down in the description along with everything I'm putting on the Trans Am today. So before we get started here, I just want to give you guys a little information on these hubs and the actual calipers that I went with, because these babies are some freaking feat of engineering. First of all, they're T6 aluminum, all CNC'd, 3.5 pounds lighter than just a standard cast iron hub, and that's per side. So we're about 7 pounds lighter just by swapping these hubs out. They already come with longer pressed in studs, because remember, we got to put a rotor over this, and we want to make sure that the lug nut is going to have the same amount of thread engagement after that extra thickness is added to there. And these are machined with a taller rotor and wheel register, so they are made specifically for a brake swap. They do come with the larger, more desirable 1LE bearings, so they're better for heat, better for performance, and they actually use all stock stuff. So you could get just, you know, stock replacement 1LE wheel bearings, wheel seal, you know, washer, nut, all that. It's gonna go right onto this hub. Same thing with the dust cap. And I think the coolest thing is that they have been actually testing these things out since 2013. Autocross, road racing, 24-hour endurance racing, even a standing mile car. So they are racetrack proven. They are more than qualified for the old Trans Am here. And for my conversion, I did decide to go with a 2002 Camaro 4th Gen LS1 caliper. Reasons for this was so I could still fit the factory 16-inch wheels on the car. Remember, I'm trying to make a sleeper out of this thing, and I didn't want to have to go to a larger aftermarket wheel. So I actually powder coated these myself. I got the decal off of eBay. I rebuilt them, all new seals. They are pretty much ready to go. New sliders, new boots here. I'm actually gonna go over this in another video when we tackle the rear brakes. So if you wanna see exactly how I powder coated them, sandblasted them, that will be a video that'll eventually come out. So, what makes the stock brakes so terrible? First of all, I just wanna say, if you're daily driving your car, you're not pushing it, you're kind of just, you know, using it on the street, taking it to work, not asking much for it performance-wise, the factory brakes are more than adequate for that job. Now, on the other hand, if you're taking it to weekend track days, maybe autocrossing it, even if you just drive aggressively, the brakes that come factory on these cars are not at all suitable for any kind of performance. I'm in the Camaro right now because I figured it was kind of fitting. This is the first car I actually did this brake conversion on, and this car actually did have LS1 brakes on it before I went to the 4-piston Brembos that are on it right now. But basically what it comes down to, the brakes that came on these cars, they have a small rotor. They got a small little 10.5-inch rotor. They got a cast iron single piston caliper. The funny thing is they made these cars for 10 years. If you went into a dealer in 1982, bought like a base model Pontiac Firebird, you know, no options, 4-cylinder Iron Duke, it actually came with the same exact front brakes that a 92 Z28 would have came with 10 years later with more than double the horsepower. So the brakes that were put on these cars, they were not at all geared towards performance. It was kind of just like a parts bin setup. GM used them on the G bodies, they used them on vans, they used them on trucks. I think Blazers had the exact same brake setup. It was really just a recycled kind of brake setup. And if you're looking to push these cars, it is not something you want to gloss over. You want to upgrade it. So here's a quick look at the tools we're going to be using to do the conversion. You're going to want a Sawzall, a tap and die set, and a drill bit set. That's pretty much the more uncommon stuff we're going to be using to get this done. Other than that, we have all new parts, including our beautiful BigBrakeUpgrade.com aluminum hubs. We have new wheel seals, including 1LE inner and outer bearings. We have our 4th Gen Camaro LS1 calipers, along with the Big Brake Upgrade conversion brackets. I also picked up some synthetic Mobil 1 wheel bearing grease, and we are going to be installing brand new brake hoses on both sides. These are stock 3rd Gen brake hoses, which is another great thing about this conversion. You don't have to get aftermarket kind of different hoses to make them fit. For pads and rotors, I went with this Power Stop set I got from Summit Racing. Unfortunately, all this stuff was wrong. The rotors wouldn't fit over the hubs. The brake pads were a completely wrong style. I'm assuming they just grabbed the wrong thing off the shelf, so we're just gonna have to go to the parts store later and grab the right stuff. So before we rip off the stock brakes, let's take a good look at them. As you can see here, they do use a cast iron caliper with a single piston. You can see the slider pins are actually exposed to the elements. They're not inside the caliper bracket and protected by a boot and grease, so they're not going to move as nicely as a newer style caliper. As for the rotors, as I mentioned, they are small and they do not dissipate heat very well. You can see these rotors are actually pretty warped and they have some hot spots. So by completely chucking this setup, going to an aluminum caliper, dual piston, going to a larger rotor, it's going to stop better, it's going to be able to dissipate the heat better. And I mean, who's going to argue about better brakes? That's why brakes and suspension are the two things that I do first whenever I get a new project car. I mean, even if the car is really slow, as long as it has good brakes, turns really well, you still have a shitload of fun with it. But before that fun could be had, we do need to get this old junk off. The caliper is just held on with two 9mm headed Allen key pins. Once both of those pins are removed, the caliper just slides right off the rotor. And the bracket itself isn't going to come off because you can see it is part of that spindle. That's where the Sawzall is going to come in a little bit later. Now before I forget, I'm just going to pinch off this brake hose so we don't make a mess when the caliper comes off. Remember, we do have brand new hoses going on, so I'm really not concerned with damaging this one. So with most of the brakes broken down, last thing we need to do is remove this dust shield. The two bolts on the right are actually going to hold the new LS1 conversion bracket in place. We are going to have to drill them out and tap them for larger bolts, but the bracket is going to use these existing holes. So before we can bolt anything on, obviously this spindle needs to be modified. Now, if you don't feel comfortable doing this, you don't want to drill, tap, cut things, Big Brake Upgrade does offer a service where you can send them your spindles, they'll do all the modification for you, send them back, and you can just throw them on your car. They also do offer brake packages with the spindle included, so essentially if you buy the entire kit from them with the calipers, spindles, and everything, hubs, the whole entire brake upgrade can be a bolt-on deal. But obviously I'm going to show you guys how to modify the spindles yourself, and the first thing we're going to need to do is install this conversion bracket. Obviously something's in the way. The old caliper bracket ears need to be cut off, and those existing holes need to be drilled and tapped. Now please ignore the remaining piece of dust shield that I just installed here. I was initially going to install this just to keep some extra dust away from the back of the seal, but the way that the rotors are set up compared to stock, the seal is no longer surrounded by the fins on the rotor, so you don't have to worry about brake dust or anything essentially getting to that seal, so you'll see I ditched it later on in the video. So before I whip the Sawzall out and get to the point of no return, I'm just going to pull the clip out, kind of move the brake hose away because we don't want that interfering with our cut. So I found the Sawzall to be very useful for making this cut. If you just happen to have a cutoff wheel, that'll probably get the job done too. So all I'm going to do is make a rough mark of where I want to cut, just so I kind of have a straight line to go by. And there's really nothing set in stone here. We just need to cut off the excess to make sure that the LS1 caliper is going to clear it. By all means, you could cut some off, test fit the caliper. If it doesn't fit, you could go in there and trim a little more if you're afraid of cutting too much off. But once those 2 cuts are made, last thing we need to do is trim off the bottom steering stop, because that's going to get in the way of our lower caliper bolt. But with all the cuts made to the spindle, next step is going to be to drill out and tap the existing backing plate holes. And looking at a side-by-side of the old and new bolt, you can see why the existing hardware isn't going to be enough to hold a brake on. So to make these holes large enough to fit our new hardware, we're going to need a 13/32 drill bit. So starting with the bottom hole, we're just going to drill this through until it pokes out the other side. The top is a little bit different because we're not going all the way through. So the way we're going to get the depth on that is to actually compare the depth of the drill bit against the caliper bracket. We want to make sure that we drill in far enough so the head of the bolt tightens against the bracket before it actually bottoms out in the hole. And you want to make sure you use plenty of cutting oil for this, and make sure that the drill bit is nice and straight as well. You don't want to drill this on an angle. It kind of helps that the holes are already there, so you kind of use them as a guide as you drill it. But now that we have our old backing plate holes opened up, it's time to tap them for our new hardware. So all you're going to need is a 12 by 1 3/4 or 1.75 tap. And once again, while using a good amount of cutting fluid, you're going to want to get both of these holes tapped. You just want to take it slow, run the tap down, back it off a little, and keep doing that until you get the hole fully threaded. After that, I like to put the tap on a drill bit and just kind of slowly run it in and out, get it really cleaned up, get the shavings out of there. Then obviously last, we're going to want to run one of the new bolts in there just to make sure they fit like they should. But with both our holes drilled and tapped, we are ready to mount the conversion bracket. Now the final installation of this bracket is going to require some red Loctite, but for now we're just going to put it in loosely, mount the caliper up, and make sure everything clears the way it should. It turned out that I didn't clearance the lower bracket enough, so I ended up just kind of trimming it down a little bit more with the Sawzall. Then with the spindle no longer coming in contact with the lower piston, we were ready to finally mount this thing in place for good. Now, as per BigBrakeUpgrade.com's instructions, you do want to use red Loctite on both of these bolts, as well as torque them down to 85 foot-pounds. So with our spindles finally modified to accept larger brakes, we are now ready to install our beautiful billet conversion hubs. Now before we slide these guys onto the spindles, we need to pack the new bearings with grease. And as you can see, the new hubs do use the larger 1LE outer bearing. And I'm going to link all the part numbers for these bearings below, as well as the number for the seals. Now before we can pop these bearings in for good, we do need to pack them with some grease. They do make a tool for this, but I just tend to put a little glob of it in my hand, and you can just kind of force it in with your palm. Make sure you get it all the way around the bearing. I like to do both sides just to make sure it's really packed in there good. Then I like to throw a golf ball size glob inside the hub as well. Then we're ready to drop in our inner bearing, hammer in the seal. Then I applied a little grease to the spindle and slid the whole hub assembly on. Now we're going to repeat the same process for the outer bearing. We're going to have to pack it, install it on the outside of the hub. Then we can reinstall the stock washer, screw on the nut. And as we're tightening this down, I just like to get it snug, then line it up with the first hole in the castle nut. That's going to allow you to get just enough preload on there, be able to slip the cotter pin in. Then we can put our brand new dust cap on, and finally, we're ready to put the rotor on.
All right, so we got our hub installed, preload is good, and we're pretty much ready to bolt the brakes on. But I ran into a little bit of an issue. The brakes that they sent me don't fit over the hub. Now, I already looked into this. This is the correct kit that I ordered. It's supposed to be a 98-02 LS1, front and rear quick stop brake kit. I do have the front brake, front passenger. Well, technically this is front passenger side, but they're the same size to go over the hubs. And this has nothing to do with the hub, because this is machined for a factory rotor. I guess Summit just pulled the wrong number off the shelf. So I went down to my local parts house, and I just got factory replacement rotors for a 2002 LS1 Camaro. And voila. So the factory LS1 rotor diameter is 12 inch instead of the stock 10.5 inch. So when it comes to this rotor, not only are we going to have more contact area for the pads, the extra diameter obviously means more metal, and that's just going to keep the heat away longer and keep brake fade at bay. So after wiping down the rotors to remove the protective oily coating, we're ready to slip them over our new hubs, and then we're finally ready to install our shiny new LS1 calipers. And as per BigBrakeUpgrade.com's instructions, you need to use blue Loctite on these bolts. Unfortunately, I didn't have any on hand, so I just put a tiny bit of red on the ends. And once these are installed, once again, we're going to be torquing them down to 85 foot-pounds. And as you can see, with everything mounted up, the rotor has perfect clearance on both sides of the caliper bracket, so we're finally ready to install new brake pads. For this, I decided to go with a set of Hawk HPS pads. Now remember, the Stop Tech kit we got from Summit didn't fit, so I had to get these overnighted, but they did have some pretty great reviews, so they should be a nice street and track pad. So the caliper all mounted up. Lastly, we need to install our new brake hose. To do this, we're going to need to remove this outer protective covering because we're going to actually mount this in a different way from stock. You can see at the end of the hose, there's kind of a notch, and then the top kind of sticks out. We actually need to flip this so the notch is facing up and the flat part is against the caliper. Now to bolt this up, we are going to be using the LS1 banjo bolt. You can't use the 3rd gen one for this, but with a couple of new copper washers, simply mount it so the hose is facing up. Then we can route it through the stock holding bracket, reinstall the clip. Then we can finish removing the rest of the old hose. Just clean the area with some brake clean, pop the new one in, make our brake line connection to the new hose after installing the clip. And lastly, we want to make sure that we tighten down that banjo bolt going to our new caliper. Now the final step before bleeding and reinstalling the wheel, we just want to adjust the brake hose. You might have a little too much slop on the top and the bottom, so you're going to want to apply a little bit of silicone lubricant. Don't use any kind of penetrating oil, and then this is going to allow us to move the slack from the brake hose either top or bottom, depending on where you have the extra slop. Now for the last step, obviously we need to bleed the brakes. I'm just using my homemade one-man bleeder here, cracking the bleeder, submerging the hose in fluid, and then just sitting in the car and pumping it. You can check out my video where I actually flush the brake fluid on this car right at the top of the screen, but with all the air out of the caliper, let's see if the wheel's going to fit over this thing. Guys, here we are on the road with the LS1 front brakes. Oh my god, they are just so much freaking better. I mean, for one thing, the car doesn't try to pull me into oncoming traffic anymore. That vibration is gone. But after kind of driving around a little bit, doing a few medium stops at like low speed just to try to get the pads seated to get them burnished in, the braking definitely improved, as well as the pedal feel. Now keep in mind, we still have the
stock drums in the back, the stock, you know, who knows how old the hoses are in the back. We have the factory master cylinder. The brake booster, I'm pretty sure, is on its way out. There's a lot of noise. When I press the pedal, I feel like that might be leaking a little bit. But just doing the front pads and rotors, it has helped the braking on this car tremendously. And we are nowhere near done with the brakes on this thing. We're going to be tackling the backs. We're going to do an LS1 disc conversion back there. We're going to put a new brake booster, new master cylinder, new hoses in the back, and then we're going to do something with the proportioning, because the proportioning from the factory on these cars is just absolutely terrible. Not much flow to the rear wheels, and by messing with the proportioning valve, possibly putting an aftermarket in there, we're going to allow more pressure and more flow to the back brakes. They're going to work a little harder. We're going to have the discs back there, and then that paired with a new master cylinder, new brake booster, this car is going to freaking stop on a dime. I was talking to Scott at bigbreakupgrade.com, and he said I could run a GTA cross lace wheel. So if that's something you want to do, you can do it, but you do need to run a small spacer. It's not like a wheel adapter kind of spacer. I think we're talking like a little kind of shim that just kind of goes between the hub and the wheel. You'll just slide it over the lug nuts. But yeah, with the 16-inch Formula wheels, they fit over these guys with no adapters, no nothing. They just slid right over. There's plenty of room between the bell of the inside of the rim and the caliper, and there's also a lot of room between the front face of the caliper and the spokes. Once again, I want to thank Scott from bigbreakupgrade.com. He supplied us with those beautiful aluminum hubs, the LS1 brackets, as well as all the hardware to get everything set up. I'm going to put a link to everything I use in this video down in the description, but if you're on a budget, you kind of want to just get some stuff used from a junkyard, you can totally do that. Head on over to Big Break Upgrade, grab the hubs from them, grab the brackets, and once again, the possibilities are endless on what kind of brake you want to run. I ran the LS1 just because I wanted to fit them under a stock wheel, but you could go with the CTSV 4-piston Brembo that I have on my Camaro, even something as big as the 6-piston off of the 06. They pretty much have you covered as far as the brackets, the hubs, the hoses, everything you pretty much need to just bolt brakes onto the front of this car. But before I close this video out, we do have a coupon code for you, courtesy of bigbreakupgrade.com. Use the code LSXMAT for a 10% discount. That's going to be good all the way through Cyber Monday. So 11/30, November 30th, you're going to have this code available. If you're not ready to do your conversion now, you're saving up some money for it, you can wait a little bit, and that code will still work up until Cyber Monday. But next video on this thing, we're going to be heading up to Connecticut with the Tahoe because we're picking up the new engine. I can't wait to show you guys that, because I kind of did a 180 on what I was doing using the new Camaro's old engine, and you'll see. But once again, that is going to do it for this one, guys. I'll see you in the next one. I kind of want to do a panic stop, but I'm going to hold my drink here. I want to see if I can get a lock. Woo! Yep. It stops now.